I didn't identify with what I thought a collector looks like. I'm not white, I'm not male, and I wasn't just loaded with money. I love when I get that feeling in the pit of my stomach of, I want to know more. What is this thing? There is a denial that there are different standards at work in our society, that everybody just follows the law and we will all be just fine. Evidence doesn't show that.
Welcome to Vida Brevis, a podcast about business, art, life, and death. I'm your host, Carlos Cardenas. Here we explore how business, creativity, and philanthropy intersect through the lives of remarkable people. I talk with entrepreneurs and community leaders who are passionate collectors and visionary patrons to discover how art shapes their work, purpose, and legacy. Because life is short, but art is forever. Hello, everyone, and thank you again for joining me at Vida Brevis. I'm very, very thrilled today to have Suzanne McFayden with me on the podcast. Some of you may know Suzanne in the art world. She's very, very active on many different fronts, but she's also been writing a fair amount, and we'll let her tell us a little bit more about where these different projects might lead to in the future. But let's go ahead and get started. How are you today, Suzanne?
I'm very well. I'm so appreciative to be here, and I look forward to our conversation.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. Yeah, I'm very excited for it as well. So let's just sort of, jump right into it. So you're originally from Kingston, Jamaica, and you moved to New York, then San Francisco, then you spent some time in Geneva, Austin, Texas, and you will soon be a Parisian, right?
Yes, correct.
Wonderful. So, please tell us about these different chapters and what connects these different geographical locations and how that is applied to your activity as a patron of the arts.
Okay, so we're going way back in history. So most of the moves that I've had in my life were dictated by the need, so when I left Kingston, it was for my education. So I headed to Cornell University. Then as a young adult working, I worked in the retail industry, so my job kept me in the New York City area. And then as a young wife, my then husband and we had gone to San Francisco on a bit of a trip, and we had both liked it immediately.
Mm,
So after we had our first child, there was an opportunity for us to move there, to relocate with his job. So we did that. And then that also took us to Switzerland. And then the needs of my children took me to Austin. So this move to Paris is going to be the first move that I'm doing that is truly related to a want that I have. I have wanted to live in Paris since I was a little girl. I visited on many occasions, but daily life in a place is not the same as going for, a vacation, even an extended vacation. So, very excited to be finally doing this thing that I have always wanted to do. The second part of your question in terms of how these places are linked is giving me a little bit of a pause because,
mhm,
just at face value, I would say they're not so linked, but I would say that the journey of my life links them in a certain way. So I feel that growing up in Kingston or growing up in Jamaica, there was art everywhere around me. The way people paint, the colors people select for their houses, the way Jamaicans speak, the way that we dress. You would go to the poorest household perhaps, and you would see a jar of flowers on the table, just
mhm,
arranged very artfully. My mom loved ikebana, so she was always taking whatever flowers we had from the garden, and she had taken a small course on ikebana from a teacher at one of my schools, and so she would make these arrangements.
mm,
So I feel that although it's not a formal art, it's not visual art in the sense of a painting or a sculpture, art
mhm,
has always been a part of my life. And then the second part would be that my parents were involved in our community. So whether that was through lending a listening ear or helping a family in need with food, um, or neighbors who had migrated and needed their houses checked on, we always had that sort of community engagement. So, with that sort of a blueprint to my life, I think it's been natural to move into my community. And I found that the best way, once I had the wherewithal, when I was in college and when I was a working young adult, I wasn't necessarily thinking about it that way. But once I became a full time parent, I began getting involved with the organizations that I was taking my children to. So, for example, there is a children's museum in the Bay Area, which was newly renovated shortly after we had moved there. So, that was the first sort of formal process of philanthropy and engagement that I got involved with. And then since then, my engagement has grown out of that, whereas I found myself more drawn to visual art. I have 3 children, so whenever we went on vacation, we would go to a museum. I remember being in Tuscany with them for the first time, and we went to the Uffizi Gallery, and I hired a tour guide because, I wanted to make it enjoyable for them, and I didn't want me to be sort of getting frustrated the way you can with young children as you're trying to look
Mhm.
at quote unquote serious things. And I told her, "I just want you to give me the highlights. I want you to pick your 10 most favorite pieces of art in this museum, and that's what we're gonna do." And she was shocked. She was like, "What? What? I can't do that. That's not possible." I said, "I'm sure you can." And so we kept it to a time where the kids could enjoy, I could enjoy, and that began the journey. But out of that then came more formal involvement here in Austin, for example, where I started with a Blanton in their art club, and then
Mhm.
eventually joined the board, became the chair of the board, and then joining other institutions that I really believe in. So the Student Museum in Harlem, for example.
Mhm.
I'm also involved with Next Haven, which was founded and is run by Titus Gafar, who's a
Oh,
former
yes.
artist in residence of
Mhm.
the Student Museum program,
Mhm.
um, and really enjoying that aspect of it. So it all sort of evolved, but organically towards who I am, or as an outcropping of who I am
Mhm.
and the things that interest me. So there was never a sort of, this is what you have to do. I followed what moved me, and that's how come you and I are sitting here today.
Yeah, it sounds like a very natural or sort of organic progress, that sort of led you to these different places. And
Yes.
I understand you are currently, part of the American Friends of the Pompidou Center as well?
Yes, yes. That is the board that I've joined last of all
Mhm.
the ones that I've joined. And so I came aboard about 2 or so years ago, and right before the show Paris Noir was set to open. That was a very ambitious show, showcasing artists of African descent who had some connection to France and to Paris in particular. And it was a very worthwhile endeavor, I think. So it was nice to come on board there. But with a Pompidou also sort of closing down formally, they're going to have programs in different places.
Mhm.
The institution and the idea of the institution doesn't stop just because the building itself may have limited access or is
Oh,
closed. But I'm
yeah.
quite excited about that. And I joined before I had any sort of concrete notion of when I would go to Paris or that I
Mhm.
was even going to go to Paris. So I'm very excited for that because in my life, I have found that art, this passion of mine, is a great connector. I've met people from walks of life that I never imagined that I would meet.
Mhm.
But it's definitely connected me, and it's what I love most about it is that it's just a way of seeing. And so when you meet other people who are interested in that way of seeing, the conversation flows naturally and you're ready to just have something in common that you can discuss.
Oh, that's absolutely great. It's interesting that you say that the institution is not a building. I mean, obviously that's part of it, but at the end of the day, it's just a collection of individuals, people, and some of the ideas will overlap, but at the end of the day, it's about a certain discourse and a community that's built, and ideas are exchanged, and um, sometimes you break bread, sometimes you travel, but it is definitely a community of like-minded people at the end of the day.
Yes, I
So,
agree.
and looking back at all these different institutional positions, so the Studio Museum, the Blanton, the Pompidou now, so these are, closed door centers of cultural power. So what does it take to actually kind of move the needle when it comes to programming and things like this? I mean, what is the expectation of different board members? Like what is your sort of mandate in these institutions?
Well, every institution is going to have a different mandate,
Mhm.
based on what they do. So, for example, the Blanton is an institution where a lot of research is done, because it's attached to the University of Texas at Austin.
Mhm.
So, people come there specifically to study different parts of our collection. So the collection can be far ranging there from, Renaissance art all the way through the 21st century with an artist like Tavares Strawn, who has made that very recognizable neon, you belong here, we belong here. So that is a very different institution than, say, the Studio Museum, where our motto is where Black art lives.
Mhm.
So we are not going to have a work by, let's say, Louise Bourgeois in that collection because that is not what we're doing.
Mhm.
So the first thing I would say is that you have to really understand what the mission of the institution is that one is joining. And I also think it is very important to, I'm not an art history scholar. I am not someone who has made their entire career art. So for me, let's just take the Studio Museum where Thelma Golden, has been their curator. Well, she's had different roles. Today, she's chief curator and a very long, prestigious title from an endowed chair by the Ford Foundation. So Thelma is going to have a very singular vision, right?
Mhm.
And so then I feel that as a board member, my job is to then get behind that vision and to make sure that is something that I feel is tenable to me. So, for example, I used to belong with another, or I used to be a board member on another institution, but that institution had to do with an artist who's no longer with us. And I felt that it was like a race against time, right?
Mm.
And that was a turning point for me because it made me realize that I'm much more interested in artists. They might still be deceased, perhaps, but it's a different point of view.
Mhm.
So that sort of shaped. So the Studio Museum, for example, of course, we're going to have artists who are deceased. Sam Gilliam is in our collection. So
Mhm.
is Norman Lewis. So is Jack Whitten, and they're deceased. But it's part of a bigger mission of where Black art lives and the
Mhm.
story of diasporic Black art that interests me. So when you talk about moving the needle, I think that once you are in alignment, or once I'm in alignment with the mission of the institution, then the next things can be discussing artists that are perhaps not a part of the institution's collection to date, having
Mhm.
study meetings. For example, we have study meetings with the American Friends of the Pompidou Center all the time where we learn about artists and we learn, would
Hmm.
this artist be a good fit for the collection, right? So if you believe strongly in an artist, then you can champion that. Maybe most institutions are short on funds. So maybe you have a meeting with your friends and say, hey, I know you like this artwork as much as I do. So would you be interested in helping it come into the permanent collection? So that's one aspect. Another aspect is, championing exhibitions. If you feel this exhibition is very important. So, for example, I've contributed to the Julie Moretu exhibition when it happened at the Whitney Museum.
Mhm.
I've contributed to a work by Rasheed Johnson joining the permanent collection of the Whitney Museum. So, when you talk about moving the needle, I think it is to make sure, first and foremost, that you're in alignment with what that institution is doing, that the leaders that are there are communicating to you clearly, and then you support however you can. You join committees. Maybe you have a dinner for a visiting artist who has a show opening. I mean, there are myriad ways in which to do this, and I think they do add up to moving the needle. But first, you
Hmm.
have to be informed. You have to know what is happening. So I think being educated and informed and understanding is the first step.
Hmm. Oh, it's very, very interesting. Um, and it leads me to the next question regarding all of this is there's been quite a bit of progress for institutional representation of people of color, right? There have been
Mhm.
real
Yeah.
improvements of inclusion for the inclusion of historically overlooked artists and voices. Um, where is this progress real? And is there any aspect of it that might be still a little bit about optics? How has this evolved over the last 25 years? Obviously, the change has been positive, but where do you see this moving forward in the near future?
That's a big question. First of all,
It
25
is.
years ago, yeah, 25 years ago, I wasn't as involved in the art world as I am
Mhm.
today. So it would be hard for me to comment on what's happened in a quarter century. I
Yeah.
would say that in the last, however, 5, 6 years,
Mhm.
um, the noise around collecting artists of color, and I'm
Mhm.
going to speak more towards artists of African descent. It got very loud.
Mhm.
It got very loud, and there was a rush on. Many galleries suddenly had more artists of color on their rosters. There were more exhibitions, and I think that maybe because of the confluence of events around this noise when it was at its peak, you could think like, "Oh, this is all that is. It's a moment of being woke. It's a moment of
Mhm.
DEI," right? I've heard that bandied about. But I would say that the truth of the matter is that the artists with staying power, I think, and of course, a lot of this is going to be 2020. I think anyone could look back now and say, sure, Jean-Michel Basquiat is worth whatever the prices are at auction today because
Mhm.
he's a genius, right? But that's in hindsight with a deceased artist who's already been minted. So, but so you can't really use that. But I do feel that this work around the collections, I know collectors who've been collecting art by artists across the diaspora from the 20th century.
Mhm.
It's not new in our communities.
Mhm.
So I think to look at it just in that lens of it's something new diminishes the truth of what has happened. That a lot of these artists are finally getting their due and have been rightly added to collections across the board. So we can look
Mhm.
at Jack Whitten. I mentioned him earlier. He's
Sam
doing this
Gillian.
work. Sam Gilliam. Yeah,
Yeah, he's
Melvin
huge.
Edwards, who just passed away. These are
Mhm.
not
Yeah.
new names and faces. They're
Mhm.
just Norman Lewis, who was even, at the same time or slightly before, he was part of the ABEX movement, right?
Mhm.
But as
Mhm.
Pamela Joyner has pointed out, was excised from the margins of photographs. So when we read about Pollock or, all of those others that we know their names who are not of African descent, it might lead one without any study to think, oh, this is something new. But what I'm getting at is that it's not new. The only thing
Mhm.
that's new is that they're rightfully taking their place in the canon. And that
Mhm.
is correct. So I think for the institutions that I've frequent, um, their collecting of these artists is also not new. So
Mhm.
I think where it might feel disingenuous or an outcropping of the woke and DEI, height, right, is maybe if an institution has never had these artists represented in their collection. But still, that doesn't mean that it's symbolic, right? It
Mhm.
can't be at the prices that we have today in the market. I think it's because they genuinely believe that these artists help tell the fuller story of art history, of what was happening in a moment. And by the way, this also goes to female artists. I don't think that anyone would say that Joan Mitchell is a less talented artist than Rothko, right? But it took her a long time, and even the price disparity still exists today.
Mhm.
So it's just that hopefully we're catching up, for these things. And
Mhm.
it's not a matter of this is a freebie or we need to be, you, d- it's not a freebie. It's a merit based addition. And in most
Yeah.
cases, it's still not parity price wise.
Yeah, yeah. Lee Krasner is a good example of this, right? I
Yes.
mean,
Lee
she sort of
Krasner.
had, she's become canonized, of course, but the prices just aren't, obviously at the sort of Pollock level. But and a sort of maybe a counter, not a counter argument, but another way of looking at that is, prices are not necessarily, an indicator of quality. The market has its own dynamics that are kind of separate from, you know art historical influence.
Yes,
Yeah.
I agree. You're
Mhm.
correct. That
Mhm.
price is not the same.
Mhm.
However, it is a marker and it does become an important marker sometimes,
Mhm.
right? So wise collectors, and in this case, I'm thinking, let's say George Perez over at Perez Art Museum of Miami. I remember being on a Zoom with him during COVID and him talking about how Joan Mitchell was still a bargain. I think at the work he quoted was like $8 million. How Joan Mitchell was still a bargain compared to her male contemporaries, just on a price level, but that the quality of the work was no less. I mean, I using her because I think everybody would agree that she was a stellar artist and did something and created something, right?
Mhm.
So that's more where I'm coming with it. That in certain niches of the market price is seen as a barometer. It's not one that I go by, but we could take Alma Thomas, right, and look at the prices of her work compared to her contemporaries. Um, and so, yes, it's good if you're a collector and you want to own these works and you don't have 14 million, but you have 8 million. Of course, it's good. Um, but I think that true parity can only be achieved when we're sort of looking at people through all the different lenses and it's more standardized as opposed to
Mhm.
very arbitrary.
And like you said, it is happening, you know,
Yeah.
maybe slowly but surely is the way to look at it. And that'll sort of follow its own course, but there's definitely improvement in all of this. And just as a quick anecdote, so today we're recording this April 6th. Henry Taylor has a show that's opening tonight at the Picasso Museum in Paris.
Yes, I'm
Uh,
very excited.
Yeah, yeah, that's really, really interesting. I've known Henry for a long time, and I actually was the first dealer to exhibit Henry in
Wow.
2007. So it's very interesting to see how long we've come, in
Yes.
almost the what is it, over 15 years that we had that exhibition.
Mhm.
And here it is at the Picasso Museum, and it'll be the summer show, and it'll probably be seen by, oh my goodness,
Yes.
I don't know, thousands and thousands of people. So we'll see. But it's
Yeah.
really, really interesting the way to see that an African American from Los Angeles can basically, take over, such a storied institution as the Picasso Museum in Paris. I mean, it says a lot about the sort of canonization of African American art, in the contemporary art world today, especially when you consider the influence of African art on Picasso. It's
Yes.
fascinating, and this sort of circle, sort of closes itself. I think it's fascinating.
Yeah,
Mhm.
and so in response to that, I think that's a big part of what I'm saying. So for example,
Mhm.
um, you know, before I think it was not so common for people to take the work of Picasso or Brancusi and think about how they were looking at Africa. As a matter of fact, I think it's about a year ago, I read something where someone was heavily um, discounting any influence that Africa may have had on the work of Picasso. No, he was looking at this. Here's something else that comes from, I think it was Greek or Roman
Hmm.
art that was far more likely to have had an influence on him. And my question is going to be, why is it so hard to believe that he could have looked at Africa and he could have looked at things there and wanted to reinterpret them in a way in his own art that doesn't devalue his art.
Of
It
course
only
not. Yeah.
devalues the source that you're looking at and you're saying, oh, inspiration and continuation of the conversation of the discourse in art can only come from these very pure sources.
Yeah.
I don't believe in that. I
No.
think that all of these things, when we can unearth them and we can discuss them, we're talking about
Hmm.
parity. So then we also have to look through the lens of scholarship. Where is the
Hmm.
scholarship, right?
Hmm.
And I think that is still something that isn't happening as much as it needs to around art by artists of African descent.
Yeah.
That that is where how many books exist on Rothko, right?
Hmm.
Probably dozens and dozens. How many books exist about Henry Taylor? Yes, I know he's more contemporaneous, but you do understand what I'm saying is that that's where sometimes you see the disparity is
Hmm.
where
Hmm.
why are we still studying Rothko, not to take anything away from Rothko,
Hmm. Hmm.
but we also need to have the scholarship around artists who are working, Edmonia Lewis, the first acknowledged um, African American sculptor who disguised who she was for all the reasons that we can think of in the late 1800s. So I think the more that we can see this and we can have these conversations is the higher the chance that we will really start to achieve parity.
What was your first real encounter with art that stayed with you? Is there a particular artist or moment? What's the sort of origin story for you?
Gosh, I feel like I've had a few different origin stories. So, growing up in Jamaica, we never really went to the museum. That was seen as something maybe that wasn't important. I did have art in high school, but I have no talent when it comes to visual art. But one of my teachers was an artist. He was a sculptor, and his work is currently exhibited in the National Gallery of Art in Jamaica. But when I think about serious art, quote unquote serious art, the art that made it into textbooks or made it into books in period. It was the Picassos, the Brancusis, the Matisse. That was what was in my Encyclopedia Britannica.
Mm.
Um, and then I went to college and I took a couple art history survey courses, and it was the same usual suspects, except now there was Goya and there was Kandinsky. And I just really took a shine to Kandinsky.
Hmm.
I loved his story, that he had had one career and then he couldn't turn away from art. So he went on and then he had this stellar career, started this group, the Blue Rider. So the first time that I can remember. Of course, I wanted to go see Picasso's work in person, but the first time I can remember like an artist that I didn't know that much about, but really wanted to see the work was Kandinsky. So I went to Germany to visit family and went and did everything to do with Kandinsky. So I was very captivated by that. But, of course, by that time, Kandinsky was very expensive, and so I never thought of myself as a collector or striving to
Hmm.
collect anything. As a matter of fact, I never imagined that I would be a collector because I didn't identify with what I thought a collector looks like. I wasn't
Hmm.
white, or I'm not white still. I'm not white. I'm not male, and I wasn't just loaded with money. So
Hmm.
I bought some posters and I framed them and I hung them
Oh,
proudly, and
nice.
yeah, I was very happy.
Kandinsky, I
Um,
imagine?
yeah, Kandinsky, yeah, from an institution that had a big show on Kandinsky. And I was just very happy. I was thrilled. I was like, okay, I have my little Kandinsky. And then life went on, and I was living in Switzerland, and I heard about Basel, Switzerland.
Oh,
I don't know
wow.
how. I just sort
Mhm.
of knew that it was a thing. And so I took myself there and I made my arrangements incredibly late in the year. So I had to stay in this dinky little hotel that I took a train or something to get to the main fair. But this was really a turning point for me because I'm sure you've been to that fair
Oh, yeah,
and
many times. Mhm.
yeah. So you know and maybe it's more art fairs now, but it just felt very intimate is really what I'm getting at. You could get up close and personal to the work. There weren't any things like in museums that tell you like, "You're standing too close to the art, move back, move back." So I got really up close and personal with a lot of things I saw there. I'll never forget there was this Basquiat. The whole canvas was entirely red. It was very large canvas, like institutional sized canvas. It was red, and the only thing on it was a single gold crown, which we know is one of his usual motifs, right? And I think they were asking $12 million for it, which today would probably be a bargain, right?
Oh, yeah.
But all of a sudden, I started seeing artists that were no longer so far removed from me. Now I was having an experience where the art was exactly some of my own experiences. So, for example, of course, Basquiat has his roots in Haiti. Um, but another thing that he does in his work is he's written names like Picasso or whomever and crossed them out, right? And then he's written his name saying, I deserve a spot too, right? I have the right to insert myself into history. So this sort of not necessarily grandiosity, I don't have the right word for it at the moment, but this sort of insistence, that's what I want to say. The insistence, the urgency that he mattered to.
Mhm. Well, there was
Then
confidence there for sure.
yes, there was confidence there that I matter. And I
Mhm,
think
mhm,
when you're like in my own history as an immigrant, a Black woman, a mother, a divorcee, I have to have a lot of confidence to say, oh, I need to walk into this room, whether it's on behalf of my children or myself or whatever it is, right? To say, like, I'm going to go in here and I'm going to get what I need. But anyway,
mhm,
so I saw the Basquiat. Then I saw a Sugimoto work, one of his Cs. And that C, it was a very large installation of it, the largest size that he makes.
hmm,
And it was with Frankel Gallery, which still exists in San Francisco. And I didn't know at the time that that was an image of the Caribbean Sea, but I was very drawn to the work. So I went in and I had a conversation. And he made that work, I want to say in 1980 or 81. But the point is that I still lived in Jamaica in 1980 and 81. And I was like, oh my goodness, here is an artist that's in the most prestigious fair. And he made this work, which was the beginning of his series on my island. And I didn't even know that. So I
hmm,
felt an immediate kinship. Then I went over to Luring Augustine, which at the time represented Glenn Ligon, and they
mhm,
had a huge show and they had 2 series. They had, from the series Strangers in the Village, which is based on the Baldwin essays about going to the small Swiss town where they had never seen a Black person before, except for the representation of the Black Madonna in the church, in the cathedral that they had there. And I was like, "Oh, I understand this very well." And then they also had the joke paintings, and one of them
mm,
really spoke to me. And so that was a turning point for me because all of a sudden, art wasn't this thing that was for others. It was something that was very much to do with experiences that I'd had and could relate to. And so that was the beginning. But then
hmm,
life took some twists and turns. And then in about 2025, or sorry, 2015, I fell in love with a work by Wangechi Mutu. And I'm going to butcher the title, but it's something about Peg Leg Nightmare. But it was this beautiful figure. I still own it. It's one of her collage works. And this figure is completely naked, has her hands clasped behind her back, and is looking rather shyly over her shoulder. But one of her legs below the knee has been amputated, and we see the representation of blood at the site of amputation. And then there's a leg there. And I just felt that in life and in my own life at that time, I had been wounded, I had fallen, I had bruised myself, I had had all those experiences, but the resiliency presented in the figure, they were still
mhm,
engaging, and maybe they were a little more wary of their engagement, but they were still there. And that was the first serious piece of art that I purchased.
Thank you for listening to Vita Brevis. If you know someone who would enjoy this conversation, please share it with them. A follow or review also goes a long way in helping us grow. Thank you. And remember, life is short, but art is forever.
At some point, you become, transactional. I want to say, obviously, the work moves you clearly. But I imagine there was a point when you went from being something of a, an occasional buyer, maybe. And then at one point, you sort of became more intentional and you became a collector. At what point does one consider oneself a collector?
I have been told that once you have art storage,
Ah,
that's when you're a collector.
okay. Yeah, I've heard
So,
that too. Yeah. Yeah.
so I have art storage, therefore I am a collector. Um, I don't know that I've ever seen myself, well, I do now, but back then, I didn't see it as like, "Oh my gosh, I'm a collector." I mean,
Hmm.
back when I started, we weren't at the height of everybody is having Black artists in their collection, right? So,
Hmm.
I just started getting things that were interesting to me that I felt were connected to my journey somehow. And that was it. I also wanted my kids to see representation of
Mm.
themselves. And I think something that really sparked that aspect of it was at the time I was in an organization with someone who was married into one of the wealthiest families in America. And she was talking about her husband and the type of art that he had grown up with on the walls. She's like, this was just usual for him, right? What he saw
Mhm. Mhm.
Picasso's, um, Matisse, it was just normal. And I thought to myself, that's a great story, right? So, what are the things that would sort of mimic that for me in my household
Mhm.
where um it's just a part of who we are. And so although I didn't buy every single piece with that
Mhm.
intention, I think it worked out that way in which my children could look around and see representations of artistic brilliance coming from people who looked like them. And I
Mhm.
think it
Mhm.
just sort of evolved from there. Also, again, just to mention being an immigrant, um, my children haven't spent extensive periods of time in Jamaica. They've been there. They know I'm from there. They know I speak a different language that has its own rhythm and rules. They know all these things and they're not ashamed of it. But art is a great way in which to bring that experience more to them. So,
Hmm.
I have the edition of the Sugimoto was completely gone by the time I arrived on the scene.
Mhm.
Um, but on a trip to Japan, I was able to go to a student studio and I begged and pleaded with them to please find me something. So they found me a small one. So that hangs in my home.
I
But
saw it.
yeah, exactly, right? That
Mhm.
hangs in
Yeah.
my home. And if you went
Mhm.
in that room, you also know that there's a Carrie Mae Weems in there, about a woman who's fallen into ill repute,
Mm.
which I think is just very funny. But
Mhm.
but then I also think that it shows conceptual art by a Black artist in a way that would be very different from, say, Fred Sandback, right?
Mhm.
Or
Mhm.
any
Mhm.
other conceptual artist that you can think of, Cindy Sherman.
Mhm.
My
Mhm.
kids aren't necessarily going to relate to Cindy Sherman in a way that they would relate to this image by Carrie Mae Weems.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
that is sort of how I have come slowly but surely into being a collector. Is just looking at what interests me, where is the rigor. I'm not buying things just because a Black person made them. There's no
Mhm.
need to do that. There is so much good art out there
Mhm.
that you can get that shows off the highest of the talent, and there's enough for everyone. Of course, we won't talk about the scarcity system that makes the art world work. But yeah, I mean, so that is really how I have gotten to where I am today.
So a noticeable feature of your collection, I find it has a very sort of singular, almost idiosyncratic nature from it, unfortunately, you go to see a lot of collections these days, and, they often kind of look like each other. People are sort of checking off boxes of the must-have artists. And I feel your collection is very far removed from that kind of, cliche. Do you consider your strategies to be more curatorial or autobiographical? And are you acquiring with a sense of intuition, responsibility, or something else entirely? You mentioned, in a way, almost thinking about your children when you're building your collection.
Yes, I do think well, I was thinking about them more when they were
Hmm.
younger and they were in the homes every day.
Hmm.
Um, what images were they gonna see of themselves, right, represented, in our home? So I found that important. Growing up in my household, the images that we had were primarily family photographs, which are to me, a source of great joy and inspiration and recognition of seeing like, "Oh, here's my great-grandmother. Look how
Hmm.
beautiful she was in 1900." So there was that aspect of it. However, yes, I as I mentioned earlier, I have many different parts of myself, and so my collection was really focused around bringing those pieces to bear. So, for example, you can't see, but I'm sitting next to a large diptych by Ebony Patterson, who is mining the idea of gardens. And Jamaica, having been a colony, the garden itself can be this intense source of danger, the idea of colonization, all the things that could go into a garden. So we have this work, and I have this work, and at first glance, it's just a garden and you can see a butterfly. But if you look a little closer, you will see a snake and you will see a roach and you will see maybe a hand. Where does that hand belong to? So I've always been drawn to work that keeps inviting me in. It keeps saying, come closer. And so that's a first thing. I love when I get that feeling in the pit of my stomach of, I want to know more. What is this thing? So that's the first step. Then I am very interested in is the execution that the artist has been able to make, does that match their intention? Where is the correlation? I'm also very interested in big ideas. So, for example, if this was just a painter, let's use the ebony again. If this were just a painter or an artist who wanted to make work about gardens, that is not so interesting to me. What is interesting to me is when it goes into a bigger conversation that takes you across the globe. People have been having gardens, the gardens of Babylon was one of the original wonders of the world according to the Bible. So then ebony is tapping into something that is bigger than this one moment in time. So those are some of the things that I look for. And then can I connect? So again, just using ebony, we're from the same place. We have a similar upbringing. And I also like that she's taken something that could be a source of distress, maybe of torture, maybe of just bad things happening, and made something beautiful. So you mentioned the Sawa earlier. And I would say that, I don't think in any literature I've read Mrs. Sawa made direct reference to her time in the Japanese internment camps, but that happened. And, she works with chicken wire to make many of her sculptures. And I think, I'm always interested in the intersection of how we take the not so good things that happen to us in life and make something out of them, something more beautiful, something that maybe gives us hope. And I think that that is a bedrock of my collection is how are we seeing experience or intention translated into something from which I can draw inspiration. My home is my sanctuary. So I want it to feel nourishing and uplifting. And if I'm going to live with something, I want to have all of those feelings in it. I spent a good 6 months last year going through the collection. And as many collectors, I ended up with a lot of things because, oh, this was really good to have. But I wanted to focus and see like what is the nexus here? What am I doing? And so the short and sweet of it is that I am focused on conceptual ideas, but with no sacrifice of beauty, no sacrifice of rigor, and no sacrifice of execution. So
Hmm.
that gives me a lens whenever I'm looking at anything. Does it meet? these criteria. So to that end, yes, it would be curatorial. Legacy is a big word. Um, and I know that there's many people who are doing that. I think the only legacy or the legacy that I'm most interested in is the one where I believed I could and so I did.
Hmm.
Remember when I started out, collecting seemed to be the province of other people, or maybe I was the other. And so when I started out, I just thought, well, what represents me? That was a turning point in Basel. Here I am seeing things that are completely in tune with who I am. And what if I start from there? So that's where I started and that's where I am now. And that's the only legacy I think that really matters is as an individual, how did you move your own needle, right? What did you
Mm.
do in your corner of the world? So, and responsibility, the responsibility I feel is to support institutions that I think where their mission aligns with what I think is important and needs to be in the world. And then
Mm.
also to really educate myself, to learn more because I think education is so vital and we need
Yeah.
good stewards. You can't
Hmm.
be a good steward if you don't have education. I mean, I suppose you could go to any big time art advisory and they can help you put together something that you feel proud of in one regard, money and access. But that is not what speaks to me the most.
Yeah, yeah. Clearly, the narrative that you're weaving is deeper than that. Absolutely.
If I think about, and I said this to you, how I viewed art before, right? It was the province of dead white men. Dead white men made the art, right? And that's what went up on the walls of museums.
Hmm.
That was it, plain and simple. That was my experience. Now I'm having a different experience. I was curious. I was living in Switzerland. I'm like, of course I'm going to go to Art Basel, Switzerland. I want to go see what all the fuss is about. And it turned out to be a life-changing experience for me, right? And then all of a sudden, art was no longer. And although for me that was a turning point, those artists have been making work for decades before I came along. It was only my curiosity that led me to the intersection with them. And that's what I think a lot of people don't really recognize, right? Also, I'm not a big gatekeeper and I'm not into gatekeeping. I think there's too much of that out there. And the only way that we're going to avoid that is to have some more conversation around it,
Hmm. Hmm.
as to how can I fit into this world that I'm interested in and I don't have a bajillion dollars, right, to do it. So you mentioned collecting. I like the collections that I go to see where, oh, here's a wild card, or what looks to me like a wild card. But
Hmm.
then it turns out, no, it's perfectly there. And it takes a while, though, for you to figure out what it is that you're trying to say with your collection. That's not an overnight thing. And I remember I used to feel so stressed, like, um, this person is only collecting artists from the 1950s and 1960s. And how come I don't know that about my collection? Well, I didn't know that because it took time for me to figure out. And that's all it is that you just need time, and then your point of view that you wanna express will come into focus, you
Hmm.
know? So, yeah, but no one ever tells you that at the beginning, so hopefully I will have told someone this.
Yeah. Well, and I think you kind of just nailed it. It's about finding your own voice as opposed to just sort of, repeating what's the sort of, what's expected of a collector today.
There's collectors working today
Hmm.
that they have, a focus that's, "Well, I wanna showcase the best of Black art." Okay,
Hmm.
well, that's a very broad construct.
Yeah.
And so you see a lot of trophy pieces, what I call trophy pieces, in that they're very large. Maybe they're
Hmm.
even a commissioned work, and that's great. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just not for me.
Hmm. Hmm.
Actually, there is something wrong with that because again, it relies only on money and someone giving you access. It doesn't really rely on taste, but there is also that segment of the art market that is strictly driven by dollars and cents, that
Mhm.
drives galleries. And I think that that is absolutely true. And when you're like me, and for example, I came to realize that I wasn't going to drop millions of dollars on a special artwork or one piece of artwork, right?
Mhm.
That also forces you to recalibrate. So you don't have any board affiliations, you don't have oodles of money or an unlimited budget, but you really like this, how do you get in? You still can, but no one talks about that. The names that we see repeatedly are the names that we already know, both of the collectors and the artists. So there's that. But then maybe you can look at, someone else who's just wants the names and doesn't really care about the rest of it, you know? And I tend to stay away from those people myself.
Yeah, well, there's different, ways to engage, in the art world. I mean, it doesn't have to be, a sort of monolithic way of thinking, it's you can kinda it's great in that you can set up your own rules. I think in a lot of other sort of
Yeah,
yeah, interest in hobbies, I don't know, sports, there's tons of rules in sports. I don't know if sports is your thing, you're gonna have to follow rules, for
right.
example. Or if you're
Yeah,
really into, oh, I don't know, software or gambling or whatever, there's a lot of rules in this world. And God, the art world is pretty much anarchy,
it
for
is, and
better
that's
or for
something I
worse.
love
Yeah,
about it. I
yeah.
love that people can come into it and say, "This exists because I exist," right? There can be that level of ego to it,
Mhm,
and, okay, rock on, do your thing.
mhm.
You mentioned, for example, sports. So, if you wanted to, you could easily build, well, not super easily, but you could build your whole collection around artists that are related to sports. So, for example, you could have Ramir Bearden, who
Mhm,
was on his
mhm.
way to being a baseball player,
Yeah,
but because he was Black, he couldn't get on any teams and
mhm.
became one of the foremost collage artists.
Yeah,
Uh,
it's great work.
Across the African
Mhm,
diaspora, and I would say
mhm,
that this is a place where people would universally say his work is very good work, right?
mhm.
Then you could collect Ernie Barnes, who made
I was
all
gonna
those
say,
figures,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
So, as many people as there are as many ways that there are of collecting.
Mhm.
Um, I just don't believe in anyone who said, I am the only way to Jesus Christ. Like, immediately, I'm going to turn and run. So, I think that's something that we need to be very aware of, that if you go to MoMA, New York,
Mhm,
and
mhm.
you see all the art there. It doesn't mean that that is all the art there is to see, because you could go up to the Met. It's going to have a completely different focus, and everything there is also going to be as interesting.
Oh, it's
You
absolutely
can then go over
vast,
to
yeah.
Brooklyn, or you can go
Mhm.
up to the Bronx. You can do whatever you want to do. And I personally really like that, because I feel that my whole life I have had to create myself, I've had to make myself. And art allows me to do that very easily.
Um, Switching gears just a little bit, I know that you wrote an article in the New York Times called, "Teaching My Kids to Drive While Black." And, what strikes me about the article is, how for most young people, my daughter's, 17, so this was kind of fresh for me,
Yeah.
and this rite of passage was really about freedom and independence and all of these things. In your article, you sort of see things a little bit differently, and correct me if I'm wrong, of course. But for young Black drivers, it's more about a potential for encounters with law enforcement and confronting what unfortunately is a sort of deep-seated institutional racism and all of the assumptions that people, law enforcement, to be frank, all of the sort of assumptions that they have. Um, how is this whole driving experiment going with your kids?
Well, I'm very happy to report that my kids are very good drivers.
Oh,
So I
great.
had told them, yeah, long before I wrote that article, I
Uh-huh.
told them, I said, I don't care what any state says until you pass my driving test. I don't consider you to be, well, fully formed as a driver. So I'm happy to report that they've passed the test and that they're doing well.
Mhm.
But, yes, I think any Black parents will tell you that they've had to have a different conversation with their child than perhaps their children's friends who are not Black. Their
Mhm.
parents have not had the same conversation. And it gets so layered and nuanced because as a parent, I feel that I've had to balance this joy of this freedom. So I fully believe that getting your driver's license is a rite of passage of becoming an adult. You need to do that. So this freedom, as you just mentioned your daughter, this freedom of, oh my gosh, it's another step in my journey. I don't wanna kill that joy for
Mm-hmm.
them, you know? But yes, it's important for them to know if they get pulled over, both hands on the steering wheel, no sass, no foolishness, because it's a
Mm-hmm.
serious business. And I don't have to quote to you all the murders and, unfortunate examples that we have. So I do feel that in general, to become a parent is to never again know what it's like to not worry, right? So when my children are with me, if they go out for the evening, because now they stay up way later than I do, I still don't rest until they're back under my roof. But of course, when they're out in the world, they're not calling me every night to tell me they're home safely. They're not. That's ridiculous. So I just hate the fact that there's this extra layer. And I think what I
Mm-hmm.
hate more than that fact is when there's a denial that there are different standards at work in our society. That everybody just follows the law and we will all be just fine. Evidence doesn't show that at all. So now that all my kids are in their 20s, I think that maybe that feeling of invincibility, it's still there when you're young. It takes a long time before that goes away, right? But maybe it's a little bit more hot-headed when you're in your teens than when you're in your 20s. So all I will say to this is that today is a good day. Everyone is alive and everyone is well.
Oh, wonderful. Wonderful.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
congratulations. It's not easy being a parent, of course.
No, no, never again will I know what it is to sleep
Mm-hmm.
without or have a day without worry that,
Oh,
one is doing well or not doing so well.
yeah, we're still there too. So,
Yeah.
yeah. Do you have any other writing projects in the works right now?
I do. I'm at work on a novel currently. So I think that will take up a fair chunk of my days in Paris. And I'm looking forward to it, of really digging in and utilizing the time difference between the US and Paris in my favor for that.
Mm-hmm.
So that's something I really want to get done. Sometimes the essays, like Driving While Black essays, sometimes they come out fully formed and it's a wonderful thing. I will hope for a few more of those because they're like little palate cleansers from working on a much longer project. So I will take them if they come unbidden.
What's next for Suzanne McFayden?
Well, that is why I'm going to Paris so I can figure that out. So I the rest of my life, as I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, has been dictated by need. So at first I was a daughter and a student, and then I, continued being a student. Then I was a wife, and then I became a mother. I was also a career person at one point in time, a career outside my home. And then I turned to a career inside my home. And then we had pets, and, it's been a long journey. And I feel that whereas I've always had passion in my life, passion for art, passion for writing and reading and all those things, it's always been very tightly tied to whatever other needs were happening, operating on my life. So with art collecting, for example, that was a passion I felt I could explore while my children were still young. But I wanted to stimulate my brain cells. Um, and because I don't care what anyone tells you, raising children, whereas it is a wonderful role, there's still days when, a lot of it is repetition and it can become monotonous. So I found that the reading and the art really helped me stay grounded in who I was. But now that there's a chance to step aside, everyone is relatively launched. I want to go find out who I am. Just me and myself and I. What does that look like? So that's really what's next for me. I will be finishing this novel. Hopefully, I will sell it and it will become a resounding success, but no one guarantees that. And I know this very well from being in the art world and knowing how many artists didn't get
Hmm.
their due until well after their deaths. But I think that is not my job to worry about what will happen, that part of it. I think that my job is to produce the best art that I can. And so that's what I'm going to do.
And what a place to do it. You'll be in Paris. It sounds amazing.
Yes.
Wonderful.
Yes, I agree.
So, what would you say to the next generation, especially young Black women who are standing at the threshold of collecting and, maybe coming into the art world and wondering if there's a right place for them?
I think that there's a place for anyone who wants to become involved in the art world. I know that it can seem daunting, and there's always stories about I went to this gallery and they wouldn't give me the time of day. They wouldn't tell me the prices on the wall. They asked me what my museum affiliations were, what boards I belonged to, you know, and all of these things are true. However, there's no cost except maybe if you want to get a membership to go to your local museum. And I think that before anyone starts collecting anything, you should educate yourself. So go get some eye mileage. I've totally stolen that phrase from someone else. See art. Go to most institutions are going to have a free day. And I remember February of 2025, I went to the Whitney Museum and it was their free Friday and they had a DJ and they had drinks. And I don't think I've ever seen that many young people at a museum before, but they were all out having fun. Go to those events, grab your friends, go see what's what. Remember, this was a free Friday. So the only costs were whatever your transportation costs were, if you had a drink, right? And that's one way to start. Most institutions also have talks where, when they have an artist with a show up, they will have a time when the artist will come and speak, and it's usually again free and open to the public. And I would say that's where to begin a journey if you think art is something for you, is to do that. There's also at a slightly higher level, sometimes there are collector groups where you pay an annual fee, and that then allows you more access maybe to collector homes, as opposed to the free talk of the institution, and you can go and learn. So I don't know that there needs to be a barrier um, to anyone who wants to get involved. There will be a barrier. Yeah, sure. If you want to join the MoMA board, yes, that's a huge hurdle, but you don't have to do that today. And you can go and just look at galleries too. Every first Thursday of the month in New York, new shows go up. Again, you can go and educate yourself. So I don't think that there needs to be a barrier if you're really interested. And I would say, come on in. I am in the last third of my life, and we need all of these people. We need you. So, what was that? Was it the army that had that slogan? We need you. Come on in. If someone DMs me, not to sell me artwork, but if someone DMs me and asks me a question, I will happily answer it.
I think that's a wonderful place to stop. Thank you so much, Suzanne, for your time today.
Thank you, Carlos. I really enjoyed our conversation.